One chilly evening, a wealthy businessman was driving home after a long day at work. He had everything one could dream of: luxury cars, a sprawling mansion, and a successful career. But despite his riches, he often felt a strange emptiness inside. Life had become monotonous, and he rarely noticed the world outside his bubble. As he stopped at a red light, his eyes wandered to the sidewalk. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There, sitting on the cold pavement, was a homeless man. His clothes were tattered, his face unshaven, and his eyes hollow. But what shocked the businessman wasn't the man's condition, it was his face. The homeless man looked exactly like him. It was as if he was staring into a mirror, but one that reflected a life he could have lived. The resemblance was uncanny: the same sharp jawline, the same nose, even the same way their eyes crinkled when they squinted. The businessman couldn't look away. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? How could they look so alike? Was this some kind of twisted joke? The homeless man noticed the stare and looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. The businessman felt a strange connection, as if their lives were somehow intertwined. The light turned green, and the cars behind him honked impatiently. He drove away, but he couldn't shake the image of the homeless man from his mind. That night, he tossed and turned in his luxurious bed, unable to sleep. The face of his doppelgänger haunted him. He felt an inexplicable urge to find the man again, to talk to him, to understand how their paths had diverged so drastically. The next morning, instead of heading to his office, he drove back to the same spot. He didn't know what he would say or do, but he knew he had to see the man again. As he parked his car and stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Little did he know, this encounter would change his life forever. The businessman walked slowly down the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the area where he had seen the homeless man the previous night. The morning sun cast long shadows, and the streets were beginning to fill with people rushing to work. He felt out of place in his tailored suit, standing amidst the bustling crowd. His heart pounded as he wondered if the man would even be there. What if it had just been a trick of the light? What if he had imagined the whole thing? Just as doubt began to creep in, he spotted him. The homeless man was sitting in the same spot, wrapped in a thin blanket, his head bowed. The businessman hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. He had never spoken to someone in such a situation before. What could he possibly say? Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer and crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. The homeless man looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The businessman noticed the dirt on the man's face, the weariness in his eyes, and the faint tremble in his hands. It was like looking at a distorted version of himself, a version that had been through unimaginable struggles. "Do you need help?" the businessman asked, unsure of where to begin. The homeless man stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was rough, as if it hadn't been used in a while. "You look like me," he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. The businessman nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I noticed that too. That's why I came back. I wanted to understand." The homeless man let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Understand what? How I ended up here? Or how you didn't?" His words hit hard, and the businessman flinched. He hadn't expected such a direct response. "I didn't mean it like that," he said quickly. I feel like there's something here. Something I need to know." The homeless man studied him for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then, he sighed and looked away. "You wouldn't believe me even if I told you," he muttered. The businessman leaned in closer, his curiosity now fully ignited. "Try me," he said firmly. "Please." The homeless man hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, he said. But not here. Somewhere, quieter. The businessman stood up and extended a hand. Let's go. My car is just around the corner. As they walked together, the businessman couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. The businessman led the homeless man to his car, a sleek, expensive vehicle that stood out in the modest neighborhood. He opened the passenger door, gesturing for the man to sit inside. The homeless man hesitated, looking at the pristine leather seats and then down at his dirty clothes. "I'll ruin your car," he said quietly, his voice tinged with shame. The businessman shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Please, get in." Once they were both inside, the businessman drove to a nearby cafe. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the main road, where they could talk without distractions. He ordered 2 coffees and found a secluded table in the corner. The homeless man sat awkwardly, his eyes darting around as if he wasn't used to being in such a setting. He held the warm cup of coffee with both hands, savoring the heat. "So," the businessman began, breaking the silence. "You said I wouldn't believe you. What did you mean by that?" The homeless man took a slow sip of his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and something else, something the businessman couldn't quite place. "Our lives, they're connected," the man said finally. "More than you can imagine." The businessman frowned, leaning forward. "Connected how? We've never met before yesterday. How can our lives be connected?" The homeless man sighed, setting his cup down. "It's hard to explain. But let me ask you this, do you ever feel like something's missing? Like no matter how much you have, it's never enough?" The businessman's breath caught in his throat. It was as if the man had reached into his mind and pulled out his deepest insecurities. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "All the time." The homeless man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "That's because you're living the life I was supposed to have," he said. "And I'm living the one you were meant to live." The businessman stared at him, his mind racing. "What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense." The homeless man leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. "Years ago, we were both at a crossroads. A single moment, a single decision, changed everything. You took one path, and I took the other. But somehow, our fates got tangled. I don't know how or why, but here we are, 2 sides of the same coin." The businessman felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to dismiss the man's words as nonsense, but something about them felt eerily true. "If that's the case," he said slowly, "then what do we do now?" The homeless man looked at him, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. "We fix it," he said. "Before it's too late." The businessman sat in silence, his mind swirling with questions. The homeless man's words echoed in his head, "We fix it. Before it's too late." Fix what? How? None of this made sense, yet deep down, he felt a strange pull, as if some part of him already believed the man's story. He took a sip of his coffee, trying to steady his nerves. "What do you mean, fix it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The homeless man leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "There's a place," he began, his tone low and serious. "A place where it all started. Where our paths crossed without us even knowing it. If we go back there, maybe we can undo whatever went wrong." The businessman raised an eyebrow. "Go back where? And how do you even know this?" The man hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said. "To piece things together. It's hard to explain, but I just know. It's like a memory that doesn't feel like mine, but it's there. A train station. Late at night. Rain pouring down. Do you remember anything like that?" The businessman frowned, trying to recall. And then, like a flash, it came to him. Years ago, on a stormy night, he had been at a train station. He had been young, just starting out in his career. He remembered standing under the shelter, waiting for the last train, when a stranger had approached him. The details were hazy, but he remembered a brief conversation, a decision made in haste. His heart began to race. I remember something, he said slowly. But it was so long ago. How could that have changed anything? The homeless man's eyes lit up. That's it, he said. That's the moment. Whatever happened there, it set us on these paths. We need to go back. We need to find that station. The businessman shook his head, still struggling to process everything. Even if we do, what then? What are we supposed to do? I don't know, the homeless man admitted. But I feel like if we're there together, we'll figure it out. It's our only chance. The businessman sat back, running a hand through his hair. This was insane. He had meetings to attend, deals to close, a life to maintain. And yet, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that this was important, that this man, this moment, mattered. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. We'll go. But if this turns out to be some wild goose chase, I'm done. The homeless man smiled faintly. Fair enough. As they left the cafe, the businessman couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The businessman drove through the city, the homeless man sitting silently in the passenger seat. The atmosphere inside the car was heavy with unspoken thoughts. The businessman kept glancing at the man, still struggling to reconcile the uncanny resemblance between them. It was like looking at a ghost of himself, a version of his life that had taken a very different turn. How far is this station? The businessman asked, breaking the silence. It's on the outskirts of the city, the homeless man replied. About an hour's drive, maybe more with traffic. The businessman nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but something about the man's conviction kept him going. As they drove, the homeless man began to open up. I wasn't always like this, you know, he said, staring out the window. I had dreams once. A family. A job. But one wrong decision, one bad night, and it all fell apart. The businessman glanced at him, curiosity piqued. What happened? He asked. The man sighed, his voice tinged with regret. I made a choice. A selfish one. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time, but it cost me everything. My wife left me. I lost my job. I ended up on the streets, and I've been there ever since. The businessman felt a pang of sympathy. He couldn't imagine losing everything so suddenly. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The homeless man shook his head. Don't be. It's my fault. But maybe this is my chance to make things right. The businessman didn't respond, but he couldn't help wondering if this journey was as much about the homeless man's redemption as it was about his own. When they finally reached the train station, it was just as the homeless man had described, old, run down, and eerily quiet. The rain had started to fall again, just like it had on that fateful night years ago. The businessmen parked the car, and they both stepped out, the cold wind biting at their faces. This is it, the homeless man said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. This is where it all began. The businessman looked around, trying to recall the details of that night. What now? He asked. The homeless man took a deep breath. Now, we wait. And we remember. As they stood there, the rain soaking through their clothes, the businessmen felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It was as if the past and present were colliding, and he was standing at the center of it all. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain, his life would never be the same. The rain fell harder, drenching both men as they stood under the dim glow of the station's flickering lights. The homeless man closed his eyes, as if trying to summon a memory. The businessman watched him, shivering from the cold but too captivated to move. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with anticipation. "Do you feel it?" the homeless man asked suddenly, his eyes still closed. "The pull? Like something's about to happen?" The businessman frowned, unsure of what he meant. But then, slowly, he began to notice it, a strange, almost magnetic sensation in the air. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew stronger with each passing second. I think I do," the businessman admitted, his voice trembling. "What is it?" The homeless man opened his eyes, his gaze intense. "It's the moment," he said. "The moment our paths crossed. It's still here, lingering. We just have to reach for it." Before the businessman could respond, the homeless man stepped forward, his hand outstretched as if trying to grasp something invisible. The businessman hesitated, then followed suit, mimicking the gesture. As his hand moved through the air, he felt a sudden warmth, a surge of energy that made his heart race. And then, without warning, the world around them seemed to shift. The station blurred, the rain slowing to a crawl as if time itself had been suspended. The businessman gasped, his surroundings melting into a swirl of colors and light. He felt weightless, disoriented, as if he were being pulled into a vortex. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. All he could do was watch as the scene around him transformed. When the sensation finally subsided, he found himself standing in the same station, but it was different. The walls were less worn, the lights brighter. The rain was still falling, but it felt lighter, almost comforting. He looked around, his heart pounding, and saw the homeless man standing beside him. But something was different about him too. His clothes were cleaner, his face less gaunt. He looked younger. "What's happening?" the businessman asked, his voice barely a whisper. The homeless man turned to him, a faint smile on his lips. "We're back," he said. "Back to that night. The night everything changed." The businessman's mind raced. Was this real? Had they actually traveled back in time? Before he could process it, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned and saw a younger version of himself walking toward them, his face filled with determination. The businessman's breath caught in his throat. It was him, but not him. It was the person he used to be. The homeless man stepped forward, his eyes locked on the younger version of the businessman. "This is it," he said. "Our chance to make things right." The younger version of the businessman walked past them, oblivious to their presence. He was carrying a briefcase, his face set in a look of quiet determination. The older businessman watched, his heart aching with a mix of nostalgia and regret. He remembered that night, the night he had decided to prioritize his career over everything else. It was the night he had turned away from the people who cared about him, convinced that success was all that mattered. The homeless man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the younger version. "We need to stop him," he said urgently. "We need to make him see what's at stake." The older businessman hesitated. "How? He can't see us. He can't hear us. We're like ghosts here." The homeless man shook his head. "We're not here to talk to him. We're here to show him." He reached out and grabbed the older businessman's hand. "Close your eyes," he said. "Think about your life. Think about everything you've lost. Everything you've sacrificed. Let him feel it." The older businessman closed his eyes, focusing on the memories that haunted him, the lonely nights in his empty mansion, the strained relationships, the hollow victories. As he did, he felt a strange energy building between them. When he opened his eyes, he saw a faint glow surrounding the younger version of himself. The younger man stopped walking, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been placed on him. "What's happening?" the older businessman asked, his voice filled with awe. He's feeling it, the homeless man replied. He's feeling the consequences of the choice he's about to make. The pain, the regret, the emptiness. It's all there, in his heart. The younger version of the businessman looked around, his face pale and confused. He dropped his briefcase, clutching his chest as if he were in physical pain. What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The older businessman felt a surge of emotion. He wanted to reach out, to tell his younger self that it didn't have to be this way. But before he could move, the homeless man spoke. "It's not too late," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the air. "You can still choose differently. You can still choose love, connection, and meaning. Don't let it all slip away." The younger version of the businessman looked around, his eyes wide with fear and realization. And then, slowly, he picked up his briefcase and turned around, walking back the way he had come. The older businessman watched, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know if this would change anything, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the younger version of the businessman walked away, the older businessman felt the world around him begin to blur once more. The station, the rain, the flickering lights, all of it dissolved into a swirl of colors and light. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever came next. When he opened them again, he was back in the present, standing in the same rundown station. The rain was still falling, but the air felt different, lighter, somehow. He looked around and saw the homeless man standing beside him. But something had changed. The man's face was no longer hollow with despair, instead, it was filled with a quiet peace. His clothes were still tattered, but his posture was straighter, his eyes brighter. The businessman stared at him, his heart pounding. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The homeless man smiled faintly. "I think so," he said. "I don't know how or why, but I feel different. Like a weight has been lifted." The businessman nodded, feeling the same sense of relief. He didn't know if they had truly changed the past, but something inside him had shifted. The emptiness he had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. "What happens now?" the businessman asked. The homeless man shrugged. "I don't know. But I think we've done what we came here to do. The rest is up to us." The businessman hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed the homeless man a stack of bills. "Take this," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start. Let me help you get back on your feet." The homeless man looked at the money, then back at the businessman. For a moment, he seemed about to refuse. But then he nodded, accepting the gift. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But this isn't just about money, is it?" The businessman shook his head. "No. It's about second chances. For both of us." As they left the station together, the rain began to ease, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of sunlight. The businessman felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't take it for granted. He would cherish the people in his life, the moments that mattered, and the connections that made life worth living. And as for the homeless man, he walked with a newfound determination, ready to rebuild his life one step at a time. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and though their journey had been strange and surreal, it had brought them both to a place of healing. The ending was not just speechless, it was hopeful.